Allison, just a month ago, this would have been hard to imagine. Protesters, tear gas, even National Guard troops. But the reality of it is, George Floyd's death sparked something new in America, a spark that shows no signs of slowing down anytime soon.
I can't breathe.
It's the moment that launched a movement. Nearly 8 minutes of video that shocked the nation, showing a white police officer kneeling on the neck of a black man named George Floyd. Protests in hundreds of cities across all 50 states. More than 17,000 National Guard troops deployed. Over 9,000 civilians arrested. A national reckoning that has brought both chaos and change.
Breaking news, an arrest has been made in the death of George Floyd.
All 4 officers now charged in George Floyd's death.
Stop.
In Atlanta, 1 officer fired and 2 facing charges after the shooting death of Rashard Brooks. And after months of protests in Louisville, one of the 3 police officers involved in the killing of Breonna Taylor now fired. The country also grappling with its past. Already, more than 67 statues have been removed from coast to coast, either by choice or by force.
So we all need to be in solidarity together.
The calls for justice echoing in unexpected ways, too. In the corporate world, companies like Quaker Oats changing their branding and their messaging. Even NASCAR shifting gears, banning the Confederate flag at events for the first time in its history, leading to a powerful moment of solidarity with the circuit's only black driver. But as the fires die down and the glass is swept up, more lasting signs of change have emerged. The city of Minneapolis now banning chokeholds and neck restraints, a majority of the city council promising to disband the police department and rebuild it entirely. In Los Angeles, over $100 million now pledged toward health and education in black communities, money previously allocated for police. But many activists say this is just the start.
What does this movement look like a month from now? What does it look like in a year, 5 years, 10 years?
I do think what this movement will shift. I do think we will continue to see kind of like an evolution in interest and in tactics being used with folks beginning to kind of embrace a much more explicit electoral posture. And so I absolutely see the mobilization continuing through the end of the year.
A change that can only happen in the months and the years to come.
Allison, the activists that we spoke to say they are encouraged by the changes, but they're also, quite frankly, shocked. They said that these are changes they have been fighting for decades, changes that were considered radical just a few short months ago. But they also said the real sign and the real test of whether or not this moment turns into a movement that is in fact lasting is what happens in November. They said the real question to voters as they head to the polls will be, do you see black and brown people as full citizens? And are you willing to vote and implement policies that reflect that reality? Allison?
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.